Okay, so good evening. We're ready for Genesis 24, and our goal is to get through chapter 27 tonight. So Genesis 24, this is the longest story in the book of Genesis, the story of Isaac getting a bride. So let's just jump right into it here. We'll begin verses 1 through 9.
24, 1 through 9. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac." The servant said to him, "Perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must then I take your son back to the land from which you came?" And Abraham said to him, "See to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, 'To your offspring I will give this land,' he will send an angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there." So the servant put his hand under his thigh, and Abraham his master, and swore to him concerning this matter.
Okay, so in verse 1 now we're reading that Abraham's getting well on in age. And I love this summary statement, "And the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things." We go back to chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, to the promise of blessing there. And now we're hearing a statement of fulfillment of that, at least in the life of Abraham. But of course, the promises are going to flow beyond Abraham. And that's his concern here, is to get a bride for Isaac. So who is it that he's entrusting with going back to his home country to get a wife for Isaac?
His head servant.
His head servant. We're not given a name here in this chapter. We did see in Genesis 15 at that time that he said the heir of his house was Eliezer of Damascus. So some people think that this is the same person. But again, we're not told, so we can't be 100% sure on that. Whoever he is, one of the features of this story is what a faithful servant he is. And I think that's one of the main lessons that we can take out of this story. It's a great story of servanthood. So he calls the servant who rules over his house, and he wants him to swear an oath that he will not take a wife for my son from among the daughters of the Canaanites. One of the things that we notice about the patriarchs is that they always send back home to get a wife for their son. That doesn't happen with Esau, as we'll see, but Isaac and Rebekah make sure that it does happen with Jacob. And so Abraham is sending his servant back to his homeland because he does not want a wife among the Canaanites. What do you suppose that is?
Probably just want to be linked to them, like politically or spiritually.
Yeah. We've already had the idea that the Canaanites are a cursed people, and that they're a wicked people. We saw the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, for instance. And so Abraham doesn't want to have Isaac mixed in with that lineage. So he sends him back, and he tells the servant he's going to send him back in verse 4 to take a wife. And then the servant has a concern. What's his concern? Right. I mean, this is really something. He goes to Abraham's relative's home, and he says, "Look, I've come to get a bride for my master's wife, but what if she doesn't want to come? She's never been here. She doesn't know Isaac." And so it's a legit question. And so he also says something else, which is what? If she doesn't want to come,
son back?
Yeah, should I take your son back there? And Abraham has a pretty strong answer. In the New King James, he says, beware that you do not take my son back there. Okay. And then he gives the reason why, because God had promised the land of Canaan to his descendants. And so he does not want Isaac uprooted from the land. And then he has this great statement of faith. He says, he will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. Now, we've already seen a few stories involving the angel of the Lord, two with Hagar and another with Abraham when the angel of the Lord stopped him from sacrificing Isaac. And so Abraham firmly believes that God's hand is in this and God is going to guide his servant. And so as we read through the rest of the story, we never read that an angel appears or does anything in particular, but we do see everything working out the way Abraham desires for it to be worked out. And so we can presume then that his statement that he will send his angel is in fact what God did here. So the servant swears. That's the end of this first section. And beginning in the next verses, the servant is going to go on his journey and meet Rebekah. Any questions or thoughts on verse 1 through 9 before we move on? Okay, Luke, you want to take 10 through 28, please? Nice big section. No big names, though.
Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, for all his master's goods were in his hands. And he arose and went to Mesopotamia, the city of Nahor. And he made his camels kneel down outside the city by a well of water at evening time, the time when women go out to draw water. Then he said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, please give me success this day and show kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, here I stand by the well of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now let it be that the young woman to whom I say, please let down your pitcher that I may drink, and she says, drink, and I will also give your camels to drink. Let her be the one you have appointed for your servant Isaac, and by this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. And it happened before he had finished speaking, that behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her pitcher on her shoulder. Now the young woman was very beautiful to behold, a virgin, no man had known her. And she went down to the well, filled her pitcher, and came up. And the servant ran to meet her and said, please let me drink a little water from your pitcher. So she said, drink, my lord. Then she quickly let her pitcher down to her hand and gave him a drink. And when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, I will draw water for your camels also until they have finished drinking. And she quickly emptied her pitcher into the trough, ran back to the well to draw water, and drew for all his camels. And the man, wondering at her, remained silent so as to know whether the Lord had made his journey prosperous or not. So it was, when the camels had finished drinking, that the man took a golden nose ring weighing half a shekel, and 2 bracelets for her wrists weighing 10 shekels of gold, and said, whose daughter are you? Tell me, please, is there room in your father's house for us to lodge? So she said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, Milcah's son, whom she bore to Nahor. Moreover, she said to him, we have both straw and feed enough and room to lodge. And the man bowed down his head and worshipped the Lord. And he said, blessed be the Lord God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his mercy and his truth towards my master. As for me, being on the way, the Lord led me to the house of my master's brethren. So the young woman ran and told him with his household these things.
Okay, thanks, Luke, for reading that. And so we see in verse 10 that the servant departs with 10 of his master's camels. This suggests a lot of wealth. And to be taking 10 camels, you got to be taking a lot of goods with you. And of course, the plan is to give these goods both to the bride and to her family as a gift for them, giving the woman to become Isaac's wife. So we quickly read of this journey. He makes it, we're told in verse 10, to the city of Nahor. Now that's not the name of the city. That's Nahor, Abraham's brother, where he lives. And anyone remember the name of that city? It's the city that Abraham had left from to come to Canaan. Haran. Haran. Remember, they had moved from Ur to Haran, and then from Haran he came into Canaan. So it's the city or the town of Haran. And the servant has an interesting test, because how is he to know which woman would be suited for his master, and how is he to know who's of the family of Abraham? And so he just lifts up a prayer, and we see that the servant does this frequently. He's either praying or he's thanking God. He's praising God for what God does. So he's clearly a believer. And remember, whoever this servant is, he's not in the bloodline of Abraham. So we have here an outsider, someone who's become part of Abraham's household, whether by birth or by being acquired as a servant, and yet he seems to have a very strong faith in the true God. So what's the test?
Is it actually water the camels?
Yeah, so it's give me a drink, and then also say that she would water the camels. Not such a big deal for a person to offer a stranger a drink of water. That would be customary hospitality in the ancient Near East. But to offer to give water to the camels is a huge task, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So lo and behold, the very first woman he encounters. So we're seeing the hand of God in all of this, aren't we? And he asks for a drink. And when he does, she also says, "Drink, and I will give your camels a drink." And what do we know about camels in terms of how much water they can drink? They can drink a lot. I've read a number of times how much a camel can hold, and I forget the exact figure now, but I think it's like 40 gallons. I don't know what that is in liters, but 40 gallons is a lot of water, because camels can go for days without drinking because they can hold so much. So if you have 10 camels and you're not turning on a water faucet, and you are drawing from a well, and you are presumably pouring water in a trough or something so that the camels can drink their fill, that is a lot of hard work. But as we read about Rebecca, and here she's called the young woman, we don't get her name till a little bit later, but we are told, actually we do get her name in verse 15. Sorry about that. We are told she does this very enthusiastically and with a lot of energy, doesn't she? She not only offers to do it, which is incredibly gracious, but notice verse 18. She says, "Drink, my Lord." Then she quickly let her pitcher down to her hand and gave him a drink. And when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I'll draw water for your camels." In verse 20, then she quickly emptied her pitcher. Yeah, there is a trough here. And she ran back to the well to draw water. So she is a picture of energy. Remind you of anybody earlier in the story who was hurrying about to show hospitality to strangers? Abraham, right? We're going to see a number of interesting similarities between Rebecca and Abraham. And I'll give you a list of them. I think they're at the end of this slide. But this is certainly one of them. So while she's doing all of this, we're told in verse 21 that the man wondering at her remained silent so as to know whether the Lord had made his journey prosper or not. So he doesn't jump to any conclusions, but he's like, wow, this is exactly what I prayed for. Is this the answer? And what does he give her then as a reward? Pretty generous gifts here. A nose ring. And bracelets, yeah. So those are going to be important in the story in just a moment. And then he asks who she is. And she says, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, Milcah's son, whom she bore to Nahor." So right there, he sees the connection with Abraham, his master, that Rebecca is a relative. So she invites, she says that there's not only room for him, but plenty of straw and feed for the camels. And then what does the man do in response to this? Yeah, verse 26. Then the man bowed down his head and worshiped the Lord. Again, this is a great guy who is constantly seeking God's direction, thanking God when God answers his prayer. And we'll even see him really proclaiming the name of the Lord, magnifying God's name when he recounts this story to the family. So we might think he's a bit of an evangelist as well. He's giving his testimony, how God has been faithful. So we're told in verse 28, the young woman ran and told her mother's household these things. So we'll pick up the story there, unless you guys have any other thoughts, anything you want to discuss in these verses. Okay. Short section here, Corinna, 29 to 32.
Now Rebekah had a brother named Laban, and he hurried out to the man at the spring. As soon as he had seen the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms, and he had heard Rebekah tell what the man said to her, he went out to the man and found him standing by the camels near the spring. Come, you who are blessed by the Lord, he said. Why are you standing out here? I have prepared the house and a place for the camels. So the man went to the house, and the camels were unloaded. Straw and fodder were brought for the camels, and water for him and for his men to wash their feet.
So here we meet Rebekah's brother, Laban, for the first time. And what are we told about him? And what is your initial impression of him based on the description here in these verses? He's definitely very hospitable, very welcoming.
He's focused on the gold.
There you go. He's focused on the gold. This is the first thing that we notice about him. So before he says, welcome, you're blessed of the Lord, come on in, it says he noticed the nose ring and he noticed the bracelets. So now, he's going to really pour on the charm for this wealthy stranger. Come on in, blessed of the Lord. Sometimes part of evaluating a person in Scripture is noticing either the first words they speak or the way their first actions are described. And it's definitely important here in the story of Laban because we're going to see that he is a man who cares very much about money, about financial transactions, and about trying to take advantage of other people and get the best that he can get out of them in these financial transactions. So this is a telling little note here in verse 30. Nonetheless, he's hospitable and he welcomes him in. And they provide for the man and they provide for the camels, which sets us up then for the next set of verses here, 33 through 49, Skylar.
We were set before him to eat, but he said, I will not eat until I have told about my errand. And he said, speak on. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has blessed our master greatly, and he has become great. And he has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male and female servants, and camels and donkeys. And Sarah, our master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and to him he has given all that he has. Now our master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife from our son from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I dwell. For you shall go to my father's house and to my family and take a wife for my son. And I said to my master, perhaps the woman will not follow me. But he said to me, the Lord before whom I walk will send his angel with you and prosper your way. And you shall take a wife for my son from my family and from my father's house. You will be clear from this oath when you arrive from my family, for if they will not give her to you, then you will be released from my oath. In this day I came to the well and said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, if you will now prosper the way in which I go, behold, I stand by the well of water. And it shall come to pass that when the virgin comes out to draw water, and I say to her, please give me a little water from the pitcher to drink. And she says to me, drink, and I will draw for your camels also. Let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son. But before I had finished speaking in my heart, there was Rebekah, coming out with her pitcher on her shoulder, and she went down to the well and drew water. And I said to her, please let me drink. And she made haste and let her pitcher down from her shoulder and said, drink, and I will give your camels a drink also. So I drank, and she gave the camels a drink also. And I said to her, then I asked her and said, whose daughter are you? And she said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him. So I put the nose ring on her nose and the bracelets on her wrists. And I bowed my head and worshipped the Lord, and blessed the Lord, God of my master Abraham, who had led me in the way of truth to take the daughter of my master's brother for his son. Now if you will deal kindly and truly with my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, that I may return to the right hand.
Okay, so the servant relates this whole story again, doesn't he? It's not a word-for-word account, but it's a very good summary of everything that he experienced. And we're told in verse 33 that food was set before him, but he said, I will not eat until I have told about my errand. The thing about this guy's been on a long trip. Sure, he's tired. Sure, he's hungry. And in the ancient Near East, the right thing to do when you are a guest in someone's house and they're showing you hospitality, they set food before you, you dig in and eat it, because that is a way of showing respect and complimenting them. So he's breaking protocol here because, sorry, kind of spitting in the air. He's breaking protocol here because he believes that his appointed task is more important than the food that he eats. So again, we see his faithfulness to the task that he's been assigned by his master Abraham. Okay, so he repeats the story. And I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights here. If there's anything that you want to either talk about or you have a question about, feel free. But notice that as he's telling the story, he says, perhaps the woman won't follow me. And my master said, you know, the Lord's going to send his angel on the way to prosper you. So again, we have this mention of the angel. And we've seen to this point that indeed the servant has been prospered. So we can believe that God's angel has directed and guided the servant. And then as he finishes relating the story, in verse 48, he says, I bowed my head and worshiped the Lord and blessed the Lord God of my master Abraham, who had led me in the way of truth to take the daughter of my master's brother for his son. So he doesn't take any credit for this journey. He lays all the glory at God's feet. So this is a great guy. And as I said, he's maybe a bit of an evangelist here because he's proclaiming the deeds of the Lord. He's magnifying God's name and how faithful God had been in guiding him to his master's family's house. Okay, so do you guys have anything in these verses that maybe you had a question about or jumped out that I skipped over quickly?
What is the significance of the bracelets and nose ring?
I think they're originally given as a gift, both for the hard work that Rebecca puts in, because he actually gives her the gift before he asks who she is. So later we're going to see he gives gifts to her and to all of the family. Those are gifts, bride gifts, right? In the ancient world, they did what was called a bride price. So if a man was going to marry a woman, they would give gifts to the family of the woman and they would give gifts to the woman. Why would they do that? Because they're taking something precious away from that family. They're taking the woman away from the family. So it was called a bride price. And in the following verses, we're going to see that he gives this bride price. But the nose ring and the bracelets, they're a gift, I think, for the hard work that she did. And then another reason they're mentioned is to point up, to at least alert us to the fact that her brother Laban seems sort of interested in wealth, in things that express wealth. Okay, yeah, good. Anything else? Okay, so since we have a lot of repetition here, I didn't want to belabor the point and go verse by verse through this section. So if you guys are happy, we're going to press on then to the next verses. So Chris, verses 50 through 53, we get the family's response.
Then Laban and Bethuel replied, "The Lord has obviously brought you here, so there is nothing we can say. Here is Rebekah, take her and go. Yes, let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed." When Abraham's servant heard their answer, he bowed down to the ground and worshipped the Lord. Then he brought out silver and gold jewelry and clothing and presented them to Rebekah. He also gave expensive presents to her brother and mother.
Okay, so back in verse 50, notice that it is both Laban and Bethuel who answer the servant's request. If you'll deal kindly with me, let me know. If not, I'm going to head on my journey. So we've said frequently in the ancient world, it wouldn't always just be the father negotiating the bride, but a brother can be involved. And here we see that Laban is heavily involved in the negotiations along with his father. So they both answer, "The thing comes from the Lord. We cannot speak to you either good, bad, or good." So, after the testimony of the servant, it's like, well, it's pretty clear God led you here. So who are we to stand in the way? And so they've just decided to leave it up to Rebekah actually they say, "Here is Rebekah, before you take her and go, let her be your master's son's wife, as the Lord has spoken." And what is the servant's response to all of this?
More presents.
Even before the presents, though. Yeah. Worshiping, right? Worshiping the Lord. And then, after giving the Lord thanks, verse 53, he breaks out the goodies. And we're told that he brought out silver, jewelry of gold, and clothing, gave them to Rebekah. And then notice he also gave precious things to her brother and to her mother. So I'm sure Laban was very happy with all of that. Okay, anything else in these verses?
It's interesting that I don't think they checked with Rebekah. This doesn't look like.
Yeah, but this is the way it usually was in the ancient world. Parents arranged marriage, or perhaps elder brothers, as in this case, arranged marriages. And it was up to the daughter, and sometimes even the son, who were getting married, just to be obedient to their parents. And marriages were often made for different reasons in the ancient world than they are today. Today, it's all based on, "Oh, I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." But in the ancient world, two very important concerns. One was family. And here we have Abraham marrying into his own family, right? And they would do this for bloodline reasons, and they would also do it for inheritance reasons, because it keeps the wealth within the family. But another reason that marriages were often arranged was for financial purposes. We even, if you look at English history, for instance, and if you're watching a period piece on some aristocrats who are trying to marry their daughter off, they'll say, "This is a good match. He comes from a good family, and they're very wealthy, and they have a position in society." Those things were very important too in this day and time. So obviously Abraham's very well off. The servant makes that obvious with 10 camel loads of stuff. And so this probably is another reason why it's a very welcoming thing for them to say, "Yeah, this is a good match for Rebekah. This is a good family, a well-off family." So those things were often more important than whether they were in love or not in those days. That's a good question. Okay, so verses 54 to 61, we read the encounter of the servant leaving with Rebekah. And here Rebekah does have a voice.
And he and the men who were with him ate and drank and stayed all night. Then they arose in the morning, and he said, "Send me away to my master." But her brother and her mother said, Let the young woman stay with us a few days, at least 10. After that, she may go. And he said to them, Do not hinder me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away so that I may go to my master. So they said, We will call the young woman and ask her personally. Then they called Rebekah and said to her, Will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. So they sent away Rebekah, their sister, and her nurse, and Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, Our sister, may you become the mother of thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gates of those who hate them. Then Rebekah and her maids arose, and they rode on the camels and followed the men. So the servant took Rebekah and departed.
Okay, so the servant has a shocking request the following morning when they get up. Send me away to my master. They met him the day before. They agreed that Rebekah could go with him to marry Abraham's son, and he's ready to depart the next day. So it probably causes them to catch their breath, and they're like, well, wait a minute, we want to spend a little more time with our daughter before we let her go. Why do you suppose the servant tells us, but why is he so anxious to leave right away?
Abraham's pretty old, so could be worried about that.
Could be worried about that. Maybe he wants to get back before Abraham dies. He gives another reason, though. Verse 56.
Says the Lord has prospered my way.
Exactly. He has seen the hand of God on this journey, and God is blessing him to fulfill his task, and he doesn't want anything to interrupt that or cause problems. So, for example, let's say he hangs out for a while longer. What if the family changes their mind? What if problems develop in the relationship somehow between the servant and the family, and they're like, no, we're not going to let this happen after all. So God is blessed, and he doesn't want to delay. And I think there's a good lesson here. When we see the blessing of God on us for something that we know he's called us to do, we shouldn't just relax and go, oh, well, God's got this thing, everything's cool. I think I'm just going to take it easy for a while, and then I'll finish the task that God called me to do. There's an urgency here that the servant feels, that since the hand of God is on him now, he wants to fulfill this mission with God's blessing. So he insists, and they say, well, let's leave it up to the young woman. If she's willing to go, then we'll let her go. And of course, Rebekah says, I will go. And so, verse 59, they sent away Rebekah with, their sister and her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. So notice the servant isn't alone. He's got other men with him. And Rebekah is given a nurse. Now, this is not like a medical nurse. This would be the one who nursed her when she was a child. So who was sort of like a surrogate mother to her. And so she is sent along with Rebekah. And then they give her a parting blessing. This blessing is significant, and we're going to talk about why in just a moment. They blessed her and they said, our sister, may you become the mother of thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gates of those who hate them. And then we also see in verse 61 that not only Rebekah and her nurse, but Rebekah's maids, so she has some servants that are sent along with her. So there's a little entourage here from the household of Rebekah that accompanies her back to the land of Canaan. I had mentioned that there's a number of interesting similarities between Rebekah and Abraham. This is worth noting. You might see a question like, who's the female Abraham in Genesis? And this would seem to be the most likely candidate. We've already noticed that she's the perfect host. Okay. A lot of energy like Abraham, full of hospitality. Secondly, she's willing to go to a land that she's never seen. She's leaving Haran to go to Canaan just the way Abraham did. This story uses the words take and go, the same words used with the call of Abraham when God called him to come to Canaan. So these verbal similarities are very strong, suggesting that she's a female Abraham here, or at least following in Abraham's footsteps by doing the same thing, making this step of faith to go to Canaan. She has a blessing pronounced upon her that she will be greatly blessed with many offspring. This is said, of course, of Abraham. It's said a little differently here. May you become the mother of thousands of 10,000s. We haven't seen it worded that way before, but the idea is, may you become the mother of a multitude of peoples. And then there is the blessing or the promise of her offspring possessing the gate of his enemies. This is the same thing that God said to Abraham back in Genesis 22 after offering up Isaac. He said that Abraham's seed would possess the gate of his enemies. So that's a direct correlation back to Genesis 22 and what God told Abraham. So as I frequently say, if there was one similarity, we might go, coincidence. But when we have a number of them, it seems to be a very sure thing that there is a tie being made between either two stories, or in this case, between two people, between Abraham and Rebekah. So all of this says that she seems to be the perfect mate for Isaac because she's so much like Isaac's dad. Anything else in these verses where she's given the choice to leave and she says that she will go? Any questions or comments?
Sure, she must have had some faith as well. If she's willing to go on a limb like this.
Exactly. And that's what we're saying. She's like Abraham in the sense that she's willing to go to a land she's never seen. And the same words that described Abraham's faith in taking and going are used here in her story. Okay, so we finish the story here in verses 62 to 67. Aoife, I think it's your turn. Your turn to read?
I just read.
Oh, you just read. Okay, we're back to Blake.
62. Now Isaac had returned from the Beer Lahai and was dwelling in the Negev. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field towards evening. And he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, there were camels coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel and said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" The servant said, "It is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. And the servants told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death.
Right. So as they're journeying back, we're told where Isaac is currently living. So he seems to be living in a different place from where his father is. Now, where is this place? Be'er Lahai Roi. Where have we seen that before? Anyone remember what it means?
Yeah.
The well of, sorry? You're very close, yeah. The well of something who sees. What's the lachai? Anyone remember? The well of the living one who sees me. Okay, and what story was this in where this well was given this name? Yeah, and this is the first story back in chapter 16 when she had fled from Sarai and was found by the angel of the Lord in the wilderness. So this is where Isaac is living. And we're told that in verse 63, Isaac went out to meditate in the field. This is an interesting expression. We're not 100% sure what it means. Anyone have a different translation than meditate? Okay. So again, we're not 100% sure what it means. It could mean meditate. It could mean taking a walk. But it also could mean having to go to the bathroom. Okay, which is something that a person might do. If they've got to go to the bathroom, they're going to go out in the field by themselves and take care of business. And sometimes someone says, "What were you doing in the bathroom?" And we'll say, "Oh, I was meditating." Right? So just bear that in mind, because in verse 64, we're told that then Rebekah lifted her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, now the English says she dismounted from her camel. Literally, the Hebrew says she fell from her camel. So
the story's so much better.
It's so much better this way. Now, there's different ways to translate this Hebrew word that means to fall. And some people say in certain contexts it means like to be lowered slowly or something. And so the idea may be that she did in fact dismount. But I love this idea that their first meeting, Isaac might be out in the field going to the bathroom. And for the first time that Rebekah sees him, he's taking care of business. And she's so shocked she falls off her camel. I love that. So, again, there's some question as to exactly how to translate the word meditate, and if the word here literally means she fell off or carries a different meaning, but it's still fun. So she says to her servant in verse 65, "Who is this man walking in the field to meet us?" And the servant said, "It is my master." So she took a veil and covered herself, which is what a fiance would do in the ancient world if her spouse-to-be was in the vicinity. So the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. I like the next verse here. It says that Isaac brought her into his mother's Sarah's tent, and we'll talk about that in a moment. He took Rebekah and she became his wife, and he loved her. So this is the first instance in the scripture that we have of a man loving a woman. And isn't it really cool how Isaac had nothing to do with this matchup? He didn't go to Haran and meet Rebekah and say, "Oh, she's the one for me." Abraham charged that to his servant, and the servant sought God's direction all the way. And when the servant brings her back, Isaac falls in love with her. It's like, yeah, this is the one for me. This is the one that God intended for me. So it's a great ending. And we're told that Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Now, what does it mean that Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent? No ideas? Well, Sarah's dead, right? So if the woman living, who would the woman living in Sarah's tent then be? Who was Sarah? she was the matriarch of the family, right? So Rebecca is taking Sarah's place now as the matriarch of the family. Okay, any other thoughts or questions on anything in chapter 24? All right, well, let's go ahead and take our first break. So we're about to finish the Abraham story here. In verses 1 through 11, we read about another wife that Abraham marries, other kids that he has, and then his life is finally summed up and we're told about his death. So let's see. Luke, is it your turn? Yeah, read the 11 verses, please.
Abraham again took a wife, and her name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan begot Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Asherim, Lephishim, and Leonim. And the sons of Midian were Epher, Hanok, Agadah, and Eldar. All these were the children of Keturah. And Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. But Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had. And while he was still living, he sent them eastward, away from Isaac his son, to the country of the east. This is the sum of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 175 years. And Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he scattered his people. And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zoar the Hittite, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Het. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. And it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac. And Isaac dwelt at Beer-lahai-roi.
Okay, so we learned that Abraham has a third wife here, and she's classed as a concubine down in verse 6. Her name is Keturah. We don't know exactly when he married her. Did he marry her right after Sarah's death? Did he maybe marry her before then, but we just are being told it now because it didn't fit into the story earlier? So it's hard to know because he gives birth to a lot of children through Keturah. And if he doesn't marry her until after Sarah's death, that means he's 137 when he starts having all of these kids, which isn't impossible with the Lord, obviously. But it would mean he was a busy guy until the day he died, right? It was promised to Abraham that he would be a father of many nations. And so not only is he the father of Isaac and Ishmael, but he is the father of all of these sons who give birth to sons who become various peoples. So a lot of these names are names that are directly related to like the land of Arabia, certainly Midian. And we'll read more about the Midianites later in Genesis. And of course, Moses flees to the land of Midian and he marries a woman there who is a Midianite. Sheba in verse 3, and I think Dedan as well. Several of these places have to do with the area of Arabia. Okay, so someone asked the other night, did the Arab peoples or those who've adopted Islam, did they all descend from Ishmael? And I said some descended from Ishmael, but Abraham had these other children, and many of these make up other Arab people groups. Okay, so we have that here. Now, it's stated very explicitly in verse 5 that Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. So Isaac is the heir of promise, and he gets most of the wealth of Abraham. But verse 6, Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines. But notice, didn't allow them to stay in the land of Canaan. They were sent eastward, away from Isaac, his son, to the country of the east. And there's that direction again. Here it's not necessarily saying these are wicked people, but it's a way of showing that they are not the son of promise. They have been sent to the east, and the son of promise remains in the land of Canaan. So how old is Abraham when he dies? 175. All of the patriarchs, of course, lived long lives, and it's very unusual at this time in history because, as I said, Abraham lives around 2000 BC. And so most people weren't living to 175 years old during this period in history. But this is part of the blessing of God on the life of Abraham. God is a God of life. God is the giver of life. And that is reflected in the ages of the patriarchs that he chooses to be part of the promised line. Although, as we're going to see, we're going to get the genealogy of Ishmael in a moment, and Ishmael lives a good long time as well. All right, so in verses 8 and following, Abraham's death is summed up. He breathes his last, dies at a good old age, an old man full of years and gathered to his people. So that's a really nice description of Abraham's passing on. And then we learn that he's buried where? Yes, and what's the name of that cave? Machpelah. And who did he buy it from? Because we're told that yet again. Remember? Chapter 23, just last night.
Zohar.
No, Zohar's the name of a town. Good try. Oh, it does say this, Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite. Okay, so Ephron, he bought it from Ephron. Now, why am I emphasizing that? Because that's the second time we've been told it, chapter 23 and chapter 25. And guess what? We're going to be told it a few more times in the book of Genesis. So obviously this was considered to be a very significant event. And it could either appear on the midterm or the final, I'm not sure. But you might want to know that Abraham purchased the cave of Machpelah from Ephron the Hittite. I'm just saying. Okay, so, and we're also reminded that Sarah was buried there. And then that Isaac dwelt in Beer Lahai Roi. Now, even though we read about Abraham's death notice here, and we're going to move on with a focus on Isaac and Isaac's children, if you calculate the number of years that Abraham lived, he did not die until Jacob and Esau were 15 years old. So this means that Abraham lived all the years that Isaac and Rebekah were married, trying to have children, because we're going to learn in a few verses it took them 20 years to have these twins. And then the twins were actually 15 years old at the death of Abraham. So we can only presume that Abraham would certainly have known Jacob and Esau. But the story doesn't tell us that, because the story has finished with what God wanted to communicate about the life of Abraham. And so it wants to tie up those loose ends and talk about his death so that it can move on to the next story, okay, which focuses on the next generations. Any thoughts or questions on verses 1 through 11? So this is the end of the Toledot of who? Terah. Remember, Toledots are always about the kids, right? So Abraham was Terah's son. In verse 12, we come upon our next Toledot in Genesis, and this is the genealogy or the Toledot of Ishmael. So let's go ahead and read verses 12 through 18.
This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's slave Hagar the Egyptian bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, listed in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, Kedar, Abiel, Midzam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Sena, Jeter, Nabish, and Kedemah. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these are the names of the 12 tribal rulers according to their settlements and camps. Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. His descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt, as you go towards Asher, and they lived in hostility toward all the tribes related to them.
Okay, so God had promised Abraham that he would make a great nation out of Ishmael. And he has, how many descendants here? 12. Yeah, we pointed that out before. Interesting biblical number here in the book of Genesis. And Corinna, how have you been fortunate the last few nights to get these lists of names,
The
huh?
Lord wants me to take Hebrew.
Maybe that's it. That could be a sign from the Lord, you're to take Hebrew. So the idea here is that God makes Ishmael fruitful and multiplies him. So again, we're seeing the grace of God. Ishmael's not the promised child, but God still loves and cares for Ishmael and his descendants. So Ishmael lives a total of 137 years, obviously not as long as Abraham, and not as long as Isaac will live, but nonetheless, if we were in good health, we might not mind living to 137. And we said that there's a pattern set up in Genesis with these Toledot. You'll have a genealogy with one Toledot, and then the next Toledot will tell a big long story, and then you'll have a genealogy, okay, which we've just had. So the next Toledot, guess what? Is going to give us another nice long story, right? And who will that Toledot be of? Isaac, that's right. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. But I found this nice chart that I wanted to put up that shows, God had promised Abraham that and Sarah as well, that they would be a father and a mother of many nations. Now we know in the New Testament that all those who are of the faith of Abraham are children of Abraham. And the true fulfillment of this is that everyone who accepts the seed of Abraham, Jesus Christ, becomes a child of Abraham. So he truly becomes a father of many nations that way. But even here in Genesis, literally speaking, Abraham becomes the father of many nations. So he fathers Ishmael, who has these 12 princes. He fathers Isaac, who has Jacob and Esau, who each become great nations themselves. And then he also has a wife, Keturah, who gives birth to many other peoples. So quite literally, Abraham becomes the father of many nations. So anything else about the life of Abraham, anything about the genealogy here of Ishmael before we head into the next section? Okay, I need to change PowerPoint slides here, so let me get the next one up. All right, so beginning with chapter 25 and verse 19 and going all the way through the end of chapter 36, we have the Toledot of Isaac, which is a story that then focuses on Isaac's descendants, Jacob and Esau, right? So in 19 through 28, we're going to read about the births of Isaac's sons. So let's go ahead and do that. Chapter 25, verses 19 through 28.
This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Dan, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea. And Rebekah his wife conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If all is well, why am I like this?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, "Two nations are under you, two people shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red, he was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. Afterward his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob.
Okay, thank you. So in verse 19, we have the Toledot of Isaac. And as I've mentioned, remember the Toledot always refers to the story of the next generation. So this is interesting because the Toledot of Isaac refers to Jacob and Esau. But before we had Ishmael's genealogy, what was the last Toledot again? Corinna had told us. The Toledot of Terah. So who do we have no Toledot of? We're missing one. We have no Toledot of Abraham, which means basically that there's not a big story about the life of Isaac. Isaac is sort of a transitional figure in the book of Genesis. We're not given as much detail about him as we are about Abraham and about Jacob. Abraham's the beginning of the whole story, so it's very important to tell his story. And Jacob is the future where the 12 tribes of Israel are going to be birthed from. So Jacob's story is obviously very significant. Isaac's not as significant. And he often comes off as sort of a passive person in the story. For instance, he doesn't go get his own bride. Abraham sends his servant to get his bride. But with the story of Jacob, Jacob will go back to Haran and acquire his wives there. So we have the only chapter that really focuses on Isaac will be chapter 26 when we get there. He's mentioned throughout the story here because he's the father of Jacob and Esau, but not a lot of attention placed on his story overall. Good test question. I don't think it'll be on the midterm. Might be on the final. Whose Toledot is missing? Now in verse 22, we read that Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as his wife. And then in 21, Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren. Oh, we've heard this story before. Barren wife. And this is the son of promise who is to carry on the promise of to be a father of many nations. And yet his wife also is barren. And how old is Isaac when Jacob and Esau are finally born?
60.
He's 60, according to verse 26. So how many years from the time he marries to the time of the birth of the twins? 20 long years. And yet the story passes over those years like that. How many years from when Abraham received the promise that he would bear a son until Isaac is born? 25. So only 5 more years, and yet we have this whole long story waiting for the birth of Isaac. So again, this shows the difference as to where the inspired author's intention lies. Could he have developed a whole story about the anguish that Isaac and Rebekah must have went through to have a child? Certainly he could have, but he doesn't. He passes over it all, okay? But we do see this similarity, that both Rebekah and Sarah were barren in the beginning. Now we're told something important that Isaac does, and what is that? We're never told this about Abraham, and what he did with Sarah. How does Rebecca finally become pregnant?
She pleaded with the Lord on her behalf.
Yeah, so Isaac intercedes in prayer for Rebecca, and it says the Lord granted his plea, and Rebecca, his wife, conceived. But it's not an easy pregnancy, is it? What happens next?
Kids are fighting in the womb.
Kids are fighting in the womb. Wow, okay. They can't even wait to be born to start fighting, huh? Boys are sometimes like that. This is interesting. I want to point out a theme to you that we're going to discover in the Jacob story. The story of Jacob is driven by a series of conflicts. There is going to be conflict between Isaac and Rebekah, as we'll shortly see. Each of them has a favorite son. Isaac loves Esau more, and Rebekah loves Jacob more. And that's going to create some family problems. There is obviously conflict between Jacob and Esau. We will also see that there is conflict between Jacob and Laban, his uncle. And we don't want to leave the ladies out of this story, so we will see that the two wives that Jacob marries, the daughters of Laban, Leah and Rachel, have conflict with each other. And then, if you'll remember, Rachel can't get pregnant, so there ends up being conflict between Jacob and Rachel, even though she's his favorite and he loves her. Later, we'll see that there is conflict between Jacob and his sons because he loves Joseph more than the others. And toward the climax of the Jacob story, we'll see that Jacob actually has conflict with the angel of the Lord here, as he actually gets in a physical wrestling match with this divine being. So we're in for a lot of struggling, okay, as we go through the Jacob story. Now, we're going to talk more about this struggle in the womb and the birth of the twins, but while we're on this subject of the conflict in Jacob's life, I want to point to the fact that there are 4 events which show this struggle that's going to end up dividing the family. First of all, we've got the struggle in the womb that is mentioned here, which is a foreshadowing of the conflict to come. But it's not only in the womb. We read that there's a struggle at birth. How is that communicated?
When she gives birth to Jacob, he's grabbing Esau's heel as he's coming out.
Yeah, it's almost like maybe he's wanting to pull Esau back so that he can be the first one out. And throughout his life, Jacob's always going to want to get the better of his older brother because he wants to be first. At the end of the chapter here, we'll read about this struggle over the birthright. And then in chapter 27, we'll read about a struggle over the blessing. So Rebecca is sufficiently troubled over this struggle she's feeling in the womb. She wants to know what's going on. So we're told that she goes to inquire of the Lord. This is interesting. Usually, if someone inquires of the Lord, they go to a prophet to get a word from the Lord. But we're not told who she goes to. And we do know that Abraham was a prophet, and he was still alive at this time. It is possible it was him, but we're not told who it was. Could be some unnamed prophet also. But she is given a prophetic oracle, a prophecy. 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. There's that sub-theme that we talked about in our introduction class to Genesis of how the younger always seems to supersede the elder. And we saw it in the last story with Isaac and Ishmael. Even though Ishmael is older, he's not the chosen son of promise. The younger son, Isaac, is. Same will happen here. This prophecy is telling us, as we read about the birth, we already know then that Jacob is going to prevail over Esau here. So she gives birth, and in verse 25, we get a very detailed description of the birth. We're told that Esau came out red, like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. Have you ever seen a baby born and they have a lot of hair, not just on their head, but have a lot of hair? It's rare these days, but I've heard of it happening. Now the names here are interesting, although unfortunately we're not certain what the name Esau means, but it does appear to be a sound play on the name Seir, which means hairy. Esau and Seir, well, they have some similar sounds to them, consonants and vowel sounds. Now, the word Seir, hairy, is definitely a wordplay on what will later become the capital city of Esau's nation, Seir. Okay, so Seir, Seir. So there's definitely a wordplay when it says that Esau came out hairy, a wordplay on what will become the eventual capital of his country. And then after Esau comes out, of course, Jacob comes out, and we are told that he comes out grabbing the heel of Esau. Now, some people think then that the name Jacob means heel grabber, but it doesn't, okay? What it does is that the name Jacob sounds like the Hebrew word for heel. And so there's a play being made on the name of Jacob and him holding his brother's heel. And someone who grabs the heel, what would be symbolic of that kind of person? What's being suggested?
Something like nipping, grabbing.
Yeah, so it's the idea of maybe trying to trip someone up, okay? And the idea of deceiver then comes into play here. So Jacob's name probably, scholars say, is a shortened form of Jacob El, which means may El or God protect or reward. So Jacob's name probably means may God protect. But his name in Hebrew, which is Yaakov, sounds like the Hebrew word for heel, which is Akav. And because he comes out at birth grabbing the heel, and because he's going to constantly try to trip up his older brother and deceive him, the name Jacob takes on that meaning of heel grabber or deceiver. Okay. We're told when Esau comes out that he is red. And the Hebrew word for red is Edom or Edom, okay? And in the next story where Jacob negotiates for the birthright, this name Edom is going to come up again. But until then, I wanted to show you an interesting slide. Years ago, when we took a trip to Israel, we had the opportunity to also go over to Jordan and go to Petra. And on the drive, you go through what would have been the territory of ancient Edom. And what struck me was that the mountains are red. And Esau's nickname is Edom, or red. And he ends up living in a red country. So it all seems to fit. He comes out red. He sells his birthright for some red stew, and he lives in a country that is red. All right. Anything else here? Well, let's also mention what it says about them in verse 27, that the boys grew. Esau was a skillful hunter, man of the field. Jacob was a mild man dwelling in tents. So they're very different personalities, aren't they? The word that describes Jacob as a mild man, does anyone have a different translation there in verse 27 than mild man? A quiet temperament. So yeah, trying to show the contrast between Esau, who's an outdoorsman and a hunter, as opposed to Jacob, who's more of a homebody, taking care of the sheep and that sort of thing. The word literally in Hebrew means perfect man. Obviously, it doesn't mean that here, because Jacob is far from a perfect man. And so there's some question about what the best way to translate this word is in this context. But what is clear is that a contrast is being made between the type of person that Esau is and the type of person that Jacob is. And then we get verse 28, where we're informed about the favoritism. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Isaac liked the food that his son brought. He was a man's man. So Esau became his favorite. Maybe Rebekah loved Jacob because he hung around more. He was more available. Anyway, this leads to this idea of conflict within the family of both Isaac and Rebekah, and then later Jacob and his sons. And one of the little sub-themes running through the whole story of the patriarchs is a show of partiality, which results in family division. So if we go back to Abram and Sarah, we could argue that clearly Isaac is preferred over Ishmael. Now, clearly Abraham loved Ishmael, even pleaded with God for Ishmael to be the chosen son. Nonetheless, Sarah wasn't happy with Ishmael, and God said, no, Ishmael won't be the one, that Isaac will. And eventually, Ishmael is kicked out and has to go his own way. So there is division that takes place there. There's certainly division between Sarah and Hagar and the problems that they have. Now with Isaac and Rebekah, we're told that Isaac prefers Esau, but Rebekah prefers Jacob. And there's going to create a competition between the brothers. It's going to result in Esau actually wanting to murder his brother Jacob. When we get to the story of Jacob, we know who he prefers, right? Who's that? Joseph. Joseph is the favorite. And that creates a lot of conflict between Joseph and his brothers. So throughout the story of Genesis with the patriarchs, we see this preferential treatment of one over the other, which leads to family conflict and problems. Okay, it's one of those little sub-themes running through the book. Okay, anything else here on the birth story or anything that we've talked about before we conclude the rest of this chapter? All right, let's move ahead to the story of Esau selling his birthright, verses 29 to 34.
One day when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau arrived home from the wilderness exhausted and hungry. Esau said to Jacob, I'm starved. Give me some of that red stew. This is how Esau got his other name, Edom, which means red. All right, Jacob replied, but trade me your reds as the firstborn son. Look, I'm dying of starvation, said Esau. What good is my birthright to me now? But Jacob said, first you must swear that your birthright is mine. So Esau swore an oath, thereby selling all his rights as the firstborn to his brother Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and lentil stew. Esau ate the meal, then got up and left. He showed contempt for his rights as the firstborn.
Okay, so we skip years ahead. The boys are grown up, and Jacob's cooking a stew when Esau comes in from the field, where obviously he's been hunting for game, and he's tired. Now, what do you make of this story? Give me an evaluation of both Esau and Jacob here.
Jacob, when he was ready, he knew exactly what he wanted. Right? So he'd been thinking this over for a while.
He's waiting for an opportunity.
Yeah.
Huh?
So
Yeah.
this was pretty good.
Okay. What do you think about a guy whose brother is really hungry and he says, I'm only going to feed you if you give me what I want? Not really very nice. And then for Esau's part, man, I'm starving to death. I'm going to die. I mean, really? Really, you're going to die? You're going to give up your birthright? You know, you couldn't wait a few more minutes till mom or dad cook you up some food or something. Yeah, or made it himself. Yeah. So it really shows how little he cares about important things like birthright. He's more immediate gratification. Okay. So I want this and I want it now, and I'm willing to trade even the most important thing in my life to have my need satisfied at this moment. So that's not a very good view of who Esau is either. So we're told here that the stew that Jacob is cooking is a red stew, and that this then is where Esau's nickname, Edom, comes from. And we were talking about Jacob. Unlike his grandfather Abraham, Jacob lacks hospitality and compassion, made worse by the fact that Esau is not a stranger, but a brother. Abraham goes to all this trouble to feed strangers. Jacob won't even feed his own brother without making a deal with him. Esau is characterized here not only as a hunter and someone who comes in from the field and he wants to have his needs immediately gratified, but by the very words that he says. When he comes in verse 30, literally in Hebrew, he says, give me some of that red stuff. Okay, he sounds like some kind of football jock or something. Give me some of that red stuff. Okay, so he's sort of a gruff type of individual. You know, he's this hunter, smelly hunter coming in from the field. Give me some of that red stuff. And that's where his name Red comes from. So he's characterized as sort of a gruff guy who wants his needs met immediately. And we have a rare comment by the author at the end of the story. Lots of times we're told what people do, and the inspired author gives us no comment. We're supposed to make up our own mind about it. Abraham lies about Sarah, and the author says, oh, he shouldn't have done that. No, no comment. We make our own judgments. But here, the author finds this so outrageous that he interjects a comment and says, thus Esau despised his birthright. He wants to make sure we don't miss that this is very, very significant. Okay. Of course, the writer of Hebrews picks up on this, doesn't he? He picks up on this very comment about Esau despising his birthright and being a type of the world, not caring about things of great significance. Got any thoughts or questions? Okay, we're going to jump into chapter 26. And I want to give you a map first. Last night we were talking about Abimelech when Abraham made a covenant with Abimelech. And I said that Abimelech lived in Gerar. I was trying to describe to you where it was. And I said, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have a map. So put a map in tonight. And so we have a map of the land of Canaan. And if you look down and toward the lower left-hand corner, you can see some red dotted lines. And one says way of the land of the Philistines. And then right by the, we have the city of Gerar. So this is the area in which Abimelech and his people live. And I want to point that out now because Isaac is also going to have an encounter here with a guy named Abimelech. No doubt a descendant of the former Abimelech, as we said last night. Okay? So the story opens up in verses 1 through 6. Let's go ahead and read those verses.
There was a famine in the land besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines in Gerar. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So Isaac dwelt in Gerar.
Okay. So as we mentioned earlier, this is the only chapter that focuses on events in Isaac's life, where Isaac is the main character. It starts by telling us that once again there's a famine in the land, and it distinguishes this famine from the famine that occurred in the days of Abraham. Now, where were we told that story about the famine that occurred in the days of Abraham? Test you guys a little bit, see if you can remember what chapter. Yeah.
Is it 13?
You're close. 13 is where they returned from Egypt. So it's chapter 12, right? Remember, he comes into the land and he's not there, at least according to the verses, he's not there very long. And a famine hits and he goes down into Egypt. Now, God specifically appears to Isaac and he says in verse 2, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land and I will be with you and bless you. So Isaac is not to imitate his father when a famine hits and go down into Egypt. He is to stay in Canaan and trust that God will provide for him. And God promises to bless him. In this chapter, there's a constant reference to Isaac being Abraham's son. And we're going to notice that all of the circumstances that are described here are very similar to things that happened in the life of Abraham. It's almost like he's living his father's life all over again. And it invites us both to compare him with Abraham and to contrast him with Abraham. So a famine happens in his day, just as it happened in the days of Abraham. Abraham goes down into Egypt. Now, granted, God didn't appear to Abraham and tell him not to. But God does appear to Isaac and tell him not to. And we do see Isaac's obedience here. Okay, so perhaps he's got a more direct word from God, but he is showing a greater obedience to trust the Lord to take care of him during the famine than Abraham did. If we go back to the previous chapter, remember that Isaac's wife was barren, just like Abraham's wife was barren. And what did Isaac do?
He prayed.
He prayed, he interceded. And we never read that Abraham did that for Sarah. So right now, Isaac's coming off looking a little bit better than his dad. Okay? All right. Notice how the promises to Isaac echo those of Abraham. Hey, we've heard this stuff before. Verse 3, I give all these lands to your descendants, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. What was the oath that he swore to Abraham? Where was that recorded? Last night's lesson. After the sacrifice of Isaac, God came and swore an oath to Abraham that he would give him these promises. So Isaac was there to hear that oath. Okay? And so he says, I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham, your father. And then these next verses the next verse with these promises sound familiar. I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. That was said to Abraham. I will give your descendants all these lands. That was said to Abraham. And in your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. That was said to Abraham. So clearly the point is that everything that God promised Abraham, he is going to pass on to Isaac. And Isaac is the beneficiary of these blessings and promises. And then God says that in verse 5, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. In other words, Isaac, the reason life is going to be so good for you is because of your dad and his obedience. That is a great statement. Some of you come from parents who are believers and some of you don't. If you have parents who are believers and who have passed that faith on to you, understand the debt of gratitude that you owe them, because you have the life you have and you know God because of their life of faith. Okay? Now, some of us, and I include myself here, didn't have parents who knew the Lord at the time. And so our charge is, first of all, to be grateful that God revealed himself to us. But secondly, we can create that legacy. We want to pass that on to the next generation. And I can't pass it on to my kids since I didn't have any, but that's one of the reasons I became a Bible college teacher, so I could pass it on to the next generation. So that's sort of my way of trying to do that. But again, I think we talked about this last night, that it's important that we not only get a relationship with the Lord for ourselves, but that we do everything we possibly can to pass that on to the next generation and teach that generation to teach the next generation, and so on. So Isaac is blessed because of who Abraham was and because of his faith and obedience. We're going to take our break here. Let me make this last point. These verses introduce us to the key themes of this chapter, which is blessing. So I've listed a bunch of the verses we haven't read yet, where we're going to see this word blessing over and over and over again. Genesis, favorite word, bless, theme of Genesis, God's promise of blessing. You want to know that, right? Okay, and we see it alive and well here in the story of Isaac. And remember, if the story of Isaac is echoing the story of Abraham, then we also know the story of Abraham was a story of blessing. And the story of Abraham ended up with Abraham being old and knowing that God had blessed him in all things. Okay, so let's take a break here. I know you need it. And we'll pick up here when we come back.
Right after we move on.
Okay, so Blake, you have a question?
Yes, it's about the birthright. Why didn't the parents step in and say, no, you can't have his birthright? Like, how is it the kids, like if I told my dad, I want you to give my inheritance away to
Right.
You'd say, no, you're crazy.
Well, I'd say two things to that. First of all, Jacob makes Esau swear an oath. So when someone swears an oath in the ancient world, that's considered binding. But the other thing is, actually, Isaac tries to get around that whole thing. Whether he knows that Esau did this or not, as we get into chapter 27, remember that Isaac's going to try and give the blessing to Esau. So he does try to take matters in his own hands, but it doesn't work out quite the way he hopes. So that's a good question. All right, so in chapter 26, in verses 7 through 11, Isaac is imitating his dad, and surprise, surprise, he also picks up a bad habit that his dad has by lying about his wife being his sister. So let's read 7 through 11.
When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister," for he feared to say my wife, thinking, lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. When he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of the window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah his wife. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Behold, she is your wife. How then could you say she is my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I thought, lest I die because of her." Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, "Whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death."
All right. So obviously Isaac had picked up a trick or two from dad, and is doing the same thing. It's rather sad because his dad had made this mistake in Gerar with a former ancestor of this Abimelech. And you would have hoped that Isaac might have learned that God protected his father, and so he could expect that God would protect him. But unfortunately, he has his wife do the same thing that Abraham had Sarah do and lie. And so this is different, though, in how Abimelech discovers it. Previously, God sends judgments and plagues, or sends a dream, and the people come to realize, oh, she's this guy's wife. But here, how does it happen?
He sees him out the window. He's laughing with his wife.
Okay, yeah. Some suggest, I know, like the New King James says, Isaac showing endearment to Rebekah. Okay, so the idea is they're not just having a good laughing session, but the laughter probably involves some sort of playfulness that a brother would not do with a sister. Okay, and so it makes Abimelech realize this is no sister of his. She's obviously his wife. So he calls Isaac in and confronts him, just as Abraham had been confronted. And Isaac gives a similar answer, doesn't he? Because I said, lest I die on account of her. So Abraham had not trusted God's protection after all the promises and blessings God made to him. Isaac here says, I've confirmed the oath that I've given to Abraham. I'm giving you the same blessings. And yet, he shows a lack of faith here. So Abimelech asks our favorite question in verse 10. What is this you have done to us? Okay. You might see that question somewhere else besides Genesis. All right, so verse 11, Abimelech charged all his people, saying, "He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." So just as Abraham had been a bad example to some of these Gentile believers, so Isaac here is a bad example. Fortunately, they don't suffer the same consequences because no one had taken Rebekah to be their wife. And so there's no judgment from God on anyone. Okay, any other thoughts in these verses? Now we're going to see that Isaac does have some reason to be concerned about the people here in Gerar. As we continue to read, we'll see that he's not treated really well. And so I guess we can't blame him totally in not trusting the people there. So let's pick up with verses 12 through 22.
And Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. The man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous. He had possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and a great number of servants. So the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped up all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, and they had filled them with earth. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we." And Isaac departed from there and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar and dwelt there. And Isaac filled again the wells of water which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father. The Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. He called them by the names which his father had called them. Also Isaac's servant stood in the valley and found a well of running water there. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water is ours." So he called the name of the well Esek, because they quarreled with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that one also. So he called its name Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, because he said, "For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land."
Okay, great. So God had told Isaac, "Don't go down to Egypt, and I will bless you." And sure enough, this is what we see in verse 12. So remember, there's a famine in the land. Isaac sows in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. It's hard to do much better than 100-fold. So because of his obedience here to the Lord and not leaving, God provides an abundance for Isaac. And we have our favorite expression here, "and the Lord blessed him." And then 13, the man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous. Well, think about it. He's already received everything Abraham had, and Abraham was wealthy. And now we're hearing that God continued to prosper him even more. So much to the point that in verse 14, we're told that the Philistines envied him. So here's where some of the contention and problem is going to come in. They start stopping up the wells that Abraham had actually dug. And without wells, it's hard to water your vegetation and it's hard to water your flocks, right? So this is a life-threatening thing that the Philistines are doing to Isaac. And excuse me, and then in verse 16, Abimelech actually says to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we are." Now, this is a king of a people saying to Isaac, "You're mightier than we are." So here we have this theme of kingship again, where just as Abraham was considered a mighty prince and could battle kings and gain victories, here Isaac is seen as a threat to a king and his kingdom because of his wealth and his power. So they tell him to go away. Isaac, as we said, is a passive guy. He's not confrontational, and so he does. He leaves. He doesn't go too far away. He goes in the valley of Gerar and dwells there. And then as he redigs the wells that were dug in the days of Abraham. So again, this idea of digging up the wells that Abraham had dug, we see him once again following in his father's footsteps, doing the same things that Dad did. And that's not bad, because if Dad was a man of faith and Isaac is following in his footsteps, then Isaac is also a man of faith. You know, Jesus calls us to follow him, to walk after him. And if we are faithful disciples, that's what we'll do. Our lives will resemble the life of Jesus, right? Paul said, "Follow my example as I follow Christ." And any godly person can say the same thing to their kids, their grandkids. Follow my example as I have followed Christ. So they start digging up the wells, and then of course there's all kinds of problems here with Philistines. There's quarreling and bickering, and the names of the wells in verses 20 and 21 are names that reflect the quarreling that's going on, the Hebrew words there. But finally in 22, Isaac gets some peace. And notice to this point that every time there's a problem, Isaac moves on. Even though the Philistines are afraid of him and they say, "You're mightier than we are," he doesn't try to threaten or impose himself on others. He just, rather than confront the conflict, he moves on to another place. And finally, the Lord blesses him in verse 22 with a place that he calls Rehovot in Hebrew, which means open spaces. The Lord has finally given us room, okay, he says, and we shall be fruitful in the land. Okay, any thoughts, questions? The later it gets on a Friday night, the fewer questions and thoughts there are, right? Yes. Okay, so the next section, God appears to Isaac in Beersheba, verses 23 through 25.
From there he went to Beersheba. That night the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. There he pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well.
Okay, so Isaac has returned to the area of Beersheba. We know that Abraham had spent time there. God appears to him, repeats some of the same promises. Don't be afraid, I'm going to be with you. Okay, so Isaac's experienced all of this conflict, and God is coming to comfort and assure him that he will protect him. And then our favorite word, "I will bless you and multiply your descendants," again, for my servant Abraham's sake. So Isaac does what Dad did. He builds an altar and he calls on the name of the Lord, right? Worshiping God, proclaiming God's name. Okay, let's look at verses 26 to 33 then.
Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar and Zach, one of his friends, the commander of his army. And Isaac said to them, "Why have you come to me, since you hate me and have sent me away from you?" But they said, "We have certainly seen that the Lord is with you." So he said, "Let there now be an oath between you and us. Let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, since we have not touched you. And since we have done nothing to you but good and have sent you away in peace, you are now the blessed of the Lord." So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. Then they arose early in the morning and swore an oath with one another, and Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. It came to pass the same day that Isaac's servants came and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, "We have found water." So he called it Sheba. Therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day.
Okay, thank you. So after some time passes, Abimelech and a couple of others accompany him to speak with Isaac. They realize they've made a big mistake, right? And we have Abimelech and this guy named Phicol, the commander of the army, which reminds us of the visit that they had paid to Abraham, guys by the same name. So again, these are descendants. In verse 27, Isaac says, "Why have you come to me, since you hate me and sent me on my way?" So he's not above confronting someone when the occasion calls for it. But verse 28 is very important. "We have certainly seen that the Lord is with you." So Isaac's testimony is making an impact, okay, on those around him. And so because they see that the Lord is with Isaac, they want to make a covenant. Now, Abraham had already made a covenant with these people, and one would think that maybe it should follow through to the next generations, but obviously it hadn't. So Isaac agrees here to make a covenant with them. But verse 29, they say, you know, since we've done you no harm and we've done nothing but good to you, I would say, oh, really? What about the stopping up of all the wells and forcing me to move on over and over again? But they put the best face on. And they do say at the end of verse 29, you are now the blessed of the Lord. So Isaac makes a feast. This is what people did in covenant ceremonies in the ancient world. Covenants were often made in the atmosphere of having a feast together. So it speaks of communion, it speaks of sharing, and therefore of relationship, which is what a covenant is all about. This happens with most of the covenants that God makes with his people. When he makes the covenant at Mount Sinai, he invites Moses and Aaron and the elders up on Mount Sinai. It says they eat before him. And when Jesus makes the new covenant, he does it where? Anybody? When does Jesus institute the new covenant? The Last Supper. So what we call the Lord's Supper now. So even the new covenant is instituted by a meal or a feast. And so feasts are connected with this idea of covenant. So they have a meal together, they swear an oath, and they depart. And there's sort of a good omen here in verse 32, because when they leave, the servants of Isaac come and say, hey, guess what? We've done well and we found water. So good news. And they call it Sheva. Therefore, the city is named Beersheba to this day. Same word again that we saw in the Abraham story. Sheva means either oath or the number 7 in Hebrew. Okay, reminds us of the story of Abraham, right? So finally, in the last couple of verses, the camera pans over to what's going on in the life of Esau. Let's go ahead and read those 2 verses.
At the age of 40, Esau married 2 Hittite wives, Judith, the daughter of Beeri, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon. But Esau's wives made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah.
Okay, more bad choices on Esau's part. We could probably blame the parents too, because obviously they didn't provide enough guidance for Esau to marry different kind of women. So these are Canaanite women. And as we've already seen, Abraham was very concerned that Isaac not marry Canaanite women. And Rebekah and Isaac are both going to be very concerned, since Esau already has, that Jacob doesn't. So we'll hear more of this story in the next chapter. The last thing I want to do with this chapter is, we've seen so many parallels between the life of Abraham and the life of Isaac. I duplicated this chart, which comes from a Genesis commentary, showing many of the similarities, not all of them, because it doesn't have the barrenness of the wife on here, which would be a good one. But famine in Canaan, the wife as his sister, wealth leads to quarrels, disputes over wells, separation to end quarrels, promise of descendants, building of altars, etc., etc. And there you have the scriptures in Abraham's life, and then the parallel passages in Isaac's life where the same things occur. So Isaac's life is a copy of his dad's, as we've seen over and over again. Okay, anything else on chapter 26? Okay, so we'll move to our final chapter tonight. The focus now does shift back to the sons. We've already seen it shift to Esau, and now in chapter 27, Isaac is going to want to bless Esau, and Jacob is going to steal the blessing. So this story actually continues into chapter 28 and verse 9, but we're just going to try and get as far as chapter 27 tonight, and then next week we'll pick up with chapter 28. But we can divide this story into 7 scenes, and in each scene there are two speakers. This is very common in ancient storytelling where two people are in a scene. And then if the scene switches, you might have two of the same people or one different one or something like that. But anyway, so in scene 1, verses 1 to 4, we're going to see Isaac and Esau together. And we'll go ahead and read these verses, and then we'll chat about them. So, whose turn to read? Okay.
Now it came to pass, when Isaac was old and his eyes were so dim that he could not see, that he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son." And he answered him, "Here I am." Then he said, "Behold, now I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now therefore, please take your weapons, your quiver, and your bow, and go out to the fields and hunt game for me, and make me savory food, such as I love, and bring it to me, that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die."
Okay. So we skip to Isaac's old age. We're not given how old he is at this point. One commentator has calculated using various dates given in Scripture that Isaac was 136 here. The last we knew, Isaac had to be 100 because we're told Esau was 40 when he married these women. And remember, Isaac was 60 when Esau was born, so 40 years later, Isaac is at least 100. And if this other commentator's right, Isaac is 136. Now, how old is Isaac going to be when he dies? Anybody know? 180 years old. So he's actually going to outlive Abraham by 5 years. But if he is 136, that means he's got another 44 years to go. You ever had one of those relatives who've been on their deathbed for the last 20 years? I've known a few of those. Well, this is Isaac. I don't know when my last day is going to be. And so, before it happens, I want to pass on the blessing. So he calls Esau in and tells him that he wants to bless him. Now, we've already read that Esau was Isaac's favorite. Why was Esau his favorite? Just to remind ourselves. He likes the food. So Isaac's love for Esau is really based on his own appetite. Not a very praiseworthy thing to be able to say, well, Dad loves me because I feed him good food. So maybe if I hadn't fed him good food, Dad wouldn't love me. It's a very shallow basis on which to choose a favorite son. And it says something here about Isaac's priorities being out of whack. Because if Jacob in the prophecy, where it says that the older will serve the younger, so if Jacob is the chosen one, and Isaac ignores that prophecy and chooses Esau instead because Esau makes better food that he likes, then Esau's got his priority. Isaac has his priorities messed up. Now, some key words in this scene and in following verses. The word game is going to occur 8 times. And the word tasty food is going to occur 6 times. And this shows that Isaac allows physical appetite to control a spiritual decision. Always a bad choice if we allow our physical appetites to control spiritual decisions. Whatever that physical appetite might be. It may not be food, it may be something else. We're also told here that Isaac is blind, right? What do you suppose that little detail is mentioned?
Well, it's important for the rest of the story.
Very important for the rest of the story, isn't it? Yeah, this is how the deception can take place, how Jacob can pretend to be Esau because he can't physically see him. Lots of times when a disability is mentioned in the Old Testament, at least, maybe in the New as well, there is a suggestion here of also a spiritual problem. So Isaac can't see physically, but he's also having a spiritual perception problem. And that's evidence in the fact that he allows his physical appetite to control spiritual decisions. So he's not only blind physically, he's got a blind spot spiritually as well. Okay. All right, so the next scene is verses 5 through 17. Two new characters come into the story, Rebekah and Jacob, where they plot the deception.
Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son, Jacob, I heard your father speaking to your brother Esau. Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food, that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare food from them, delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. But Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, Behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him, and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing. His mother said to him, Let your curse be on me, son. Only obey my voice, and go bring them to me. So he went and took them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared delicious food such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And the skins of a young goat she put on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. And she put the delicious food on the bread which she had prepared into the hand of her son Jacob.
Okay, so Rebekah and Jacob decide to play a very dangerous game of their own. Isaac seems to be ignoring a word from the Lord and wanting to bless Esau, and Rebekah and Jacob have their own fleshly plot here to steal that blessing away. So Rebekah was eavesdropping, apparently, and she hears it all and tells Jacob to go get a couple of young goats. So Rebekah was either a really good cook and could make the goats taste like the wild game that Esau was hunting, or Isaac's taste buds maybe weren't as good as they should have been. After all, he's an old guy, and as you get older, they say that you sort of lose your sense of taste. So that could be the reason why the goats end up tasting like the wild game also. But Jacob raises an objection. What's his concern?
They might get a curse instead of a blessing.
Yeah. So, okay, Mom, we're seeking the blessing, but if I get found out, I might end up with a curse instead. And what does Rebekah say?
She would take his curse.
Yes. Let the curse be on me, my son. Something interesting is going to happen. Because of this incident, Esau is going to want to kill Jacob, and Jacob has to flee. And when Jacob finally returns, his mother will be dead. So she will never see him again. So it's very ironic that she says, the curse be upon me. So because of this act of deception, she ends up experiencing a very harsh consequence. The son that she loves the most, she will never see again. Okay. So Jacob, he's not really concerned about the deception, is he? He's simply concerned about being caught. Big difference there. He's quite happy to go along with deceiving Dad. He just is afraid of getting caught. So what does Mom do? And I know you guys know what she does, but I'm asking it for a reason.
Kind of does everything.
cooks, she gets the hair for him.
Yeah. So she cleverly takes the hair of the goat and somehow fixes it to the skin of Jacob so that he feels like a hairy man, right? Jacob says, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I'm a smooth man. Actually, I have a book in my library, and the title of it is My Brother Esau is a Hairy Man. It's all about the significance of hair in the Bible, stories that, deal with hair. It's actually an interesting book. But, the title comes from this story right here. So she puts the goat hair on Jacob, and then she does something else very clever. She takes the clothes of Esau and clothes Jacob in Esau's clothes so that he will even smell like his brother. So it's a clever plan. Let's see. Yeah, so that leads us to the next section. I do want to point out some important words that occur in these verses, or that begin occurring. The word brother is going to occur 13 times in the story. So this whole story about stealing the blessing isn't just stealing the blessing from a stranger, but we're being reminded it's stealing a blessing from a brother, okay? And then the words take and go, words which have been used in the story of Abraham and the story of Rebekah showing faith, are now used ironically in the story as words of deception. So scene 3, verses 18 through 29, Isaac blindly blesses Jacob.
So he went to his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am. Who are you, my son? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done just as you told me. Please arise, sit and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me. But Isaac said to his son, how is it that you have found it so quickly, my son? And he said, because the Lord your God brought it to me. Isaac said to Jacob, please come near that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not. So Jacob went near to Isaac his father, and he felt him and said, the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother's Esau's hands. So he blessed him. Then he said, are you really my son Esau? He said, I am. He said, bring it near to me, and I will eat of my son's game, so that my soul may bless you. So he brought it near to him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, come near now, and kiss me, my son. And he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his clothing, and blessed him, and said, surely the smell of my son is like the smell of the field which the Lord has blessed. Therefore may God give you with the dew of heaven, and the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you.
Okay, thanks, Luke. So the first thing I want to ask you guys is, tell me about Jacob when he first comes in, the things that he says to his dad.
All of it's lies.
Yeah, it's all lies. Who are you, my son? I am Esau, your firstborn. Okay, how did you get the game so quickly? Wow, it gets even worse. It's very blasphemous. The Lord your God brought it to me. Okay. So we know from the prophecy at the birth that the older is going to serve the younger. So Jacob seems to be the son of promise, but right now he's not a very likable guy. He forces his brother to sell his birthright for a pot of stew. Now he actively is participating in deceiving his old blind father, and he's outright lying to him, even in God's name. Wow. Right now, I don't like this guy too much. So what do we think of what's said here about Isaac then, after he asks these questions? What does Isaac say next? Verse 21.
He wants to know more. He's a little confused at this point. Come near, let me smell you.
Okay, at this point, come near and let me feel you, right?
Yeah.
And he says, whether you really are my son Esau or not. So there's some doubt. And why is there doubt? One of the other verses tells us. Sorry?
This doesn't sound like
Yeah. He says, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. So Isaac doesn't trust what he hears. Instead, he trusts what he touches. Okay. Now, in the Bible, words of seeing and hearing are often used as key words for developing spiritual relationship. You know, seeing God clearly, hearing God's word. Isaiah, says, seeing they will not see, hearing they will not hear. And so these are very important qualities. Well, Isaac can't see, but now he refuses to trust his ears. Instead, he's going to trust his touch, his sense of taste and smell, more senses that are related to the idea of physical appetite. So there is a message coming through here that Isaac is deceived because he doesn't trust the most important qualities of seeing and hearing. And of course, he can't see. But if he was hearing keenly enough, then it would give him spiritual insight that, no, this isn't Esau. Something's wrong here. That he chooses to ignore what his ears hear. We're told in verse 23 that he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy, like his brother Esau's hands, so he blessed him. Now, I had asked you the question of what was it that Rebecca did, and you told me, well, she took the hair of the goat and she put it on Jacob. And I said, I'm asking you that for a specific reason. Because in the future, we're going to see some other stories of deception that involve the use of a goat. And we're also going to find this expression that is used in verse 23, he did not recognize. Okay? So we want to bear those key ideas in mind as we go forward in Genesis to other stories. So in verse 24, Isaac says again, are you really my son Esau? You can see he's still doubting. And Jacob says, I am. Now here's something also that's interesting. At the beginning, Jacob is talking a lot. Who are you, my son? I'm Esau, your firstborn. I've done just as you told me. Please arise, sit, eat of my game, that your soul may bless me. And then Isaac starts to express doubt. The voice is the voice of Jacob. But the hands are the hands of Esau. Are you really my son? Jacob only says one more word through the whole event. In Hebrew, the word is I. And that's all he says. He's like, oh no, my voice is giving me away, so I am going to shut up and stop talking. Okay? So Isaac says in verse 25, bring it near to me. I'll eat of my son's game that I might bless you. And then Isaac has one more test because he's still not sure in verse 26. Come near me now and kiss me. And he came near and kissed him. And the reason we're told that Isaac did it is so he could smell the clothing. And Rebekah had been clever enough to put Esau's clothes on Jacob so that he smells like Esau. Some of the key words in these verses are the words firstborn and the word blessing. Who are you? I'm your firstborn son, Esau. And the desire here is to receive the blessing, and we're told so Isaac blessed him. Now, the reason these words jump out is in Hebrew, they're very similar. You'll notice that they have the same letters in them, but the letters are just swapped in a different order. So the word firstborn is pronounced Bekorah, and the word for blessing is pronounced Barakah. So Jacob is pretending to be the Bekorah so that he might receive the Barakah. And this is going to come back later in the story when Esau realizes that he's been deceived. So just pointing out these words occur here, and then there's going to be a big moment in the story where these words are going to be extremely significant. Okay, anything else on this particular scene? Good, because we're needing to continue on. So the next scene, scene 4, verses 30 through 40, we say here, this is where Esau comes back, and that Isaac gives Esau an anti-blessing, and we'll see what that means as we read these verses.
After Isaac finished blessing him, and Jacob had scarcely left his father's presence, his brother Esau came in from hunting. He too prepared some tasty food and brought it to his father. Then he said to him, "My father, please sit up and eat some of my game, so that you may give me your blessing." His father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" "I am your son," he answered, "your firstborn, Esau." Isaac trembled violently and said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? I ate it just before you came, and I blessed him, and indeed he will be blessed." When Esau heard his father's words, he burst out with a loud and bitter cry and said to his father, "Bless me too, my father." But he said, "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing." Esau said, "Isn't he rightly named Jacob? This is the second time he has taken advantage of me. He took my birthright, and now he's taken my blessing." Then he asked, "Haven't you reserved any blessing for me?" Isaac answered Esau, "I have made him lord over you, and have made all his relatives his servants, and I have sustained him with grain and new wine. So what can I possibly do for you, my son?" Esau said to his father, "You have only one blessing, my father. Bless me too, my father." Then Esau wept aloud. His father Isaac answered him, "Your dwelling will be away from the earth's richness, away from the dew of heaven above. You will live by the sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck."
Okay, so this is the really tragic part of the story when Esau returns, and both Isaac and Esau realize that they've been deceived. Isaac comes in Esau comes in using basically similar words that Jacob had used. He says in verse 31, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me." And Isaac says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I am your son, your firstborn, Esau," the very words that Jacob had used, right? And we see how upset Isaac gets. He knew all along something wasn't quite right. Verse 33, he trembled exceedingly. In Hebrew, he trembled a great trembling. Okay, so here's this poor old blind man, and he just starts shaking and quivering because he realizes what's going on. Verse 34, when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with an exceedingly great and bitter cry. So Isaac trembled a great trembling, and Esau cried a great cry. There's some parallel ideas going on there of the distress that they're both experiencing. And the words that are used here of Esau are really heart-wrenching. In Hebrew, the word for cry is the word yitzhak. And the name for Isaac is Yitzhak. So Yitzhak, cry, Yitzhak, Isaac. They sound very similar, and they look spelled very similar, except for the hard H sound. So Esau is crying out in front of his father, laughter. Okay? So it's a very tragic and ironic scene here. And in spite of Esau's harshness and some of the mistakes he's made. I don't know how you feel, but my heart kind of goes out for him here as he's like, don't you have one blessing for me, Father? Just one? He's just begging and pleading for anything. And this sort of shows the selfishness of Isaac, because he said, I gave him everything. What have I got left to give you? So Isaac's intent was to give Esau every blessing and leave nothing for Jacob, the child that he knew by prophecy really should be the promised son. So Isaac's selfishness backfires on him, and now the son that he wants to give everything to, he has nothing to give to him. And I like the way the version read, Corinna, that you read, from the fatness and from the dew, because the New King James makes it sound exactly like a blessing. Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth and of the dew of heaven. Well, that's exactly what was said to Jacob, but clearly, since all that was given to Jacob, the opposite is being meant here for Esau. He will not receive these things because they've been given to his brother. The only blessing he can really say is that you're going to serve your brother, but the day will come when you will break his yoke from off your neck. So he doesn't have any great words for him. And as we're going to see beginning with verse 41, Esau hates Jacob because of the blessing that his father gives him. I want to point out one more thing, and then if you have any comments or questions, feel free to ask. But down in, let's see, I had it earlier and I've lost it. Oh yeah, in verse 36, Esau said, is he not rightly named Jacob, for he has supplanted me these 2 times? So making that word play on Jacob's name, meaning deceiver. And then he says, he took away my birthright, and now look, he has taken away my blessing. So he took my Bekorah, and now he has taken my Barakah. That's that wordplay I told you we were going to see in these verses. So birthright and blessing, Jacob has stolen them as far as Esau is concerned. And now he hates his brother. You guys have any thoughts before we move on? We should move on because we only have a few minutes left here in class. So let's go ahead and read verses 41 to 45.
So Esau hated Jacob because of his blessing, which his father blessed him. Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand, and I will kill my brother Jacob. And the words of Esau, her older son, were full to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, the younger son, and said to him, surely your brother Esau comforts himself concerning you. I intend to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, go to my brother who lives in the and stay with him a few days until your brother's spirit turns away. Until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him, then I will send you and you from there. Why should I be bereaved also of you broken with me?
Okay, so Esau hates Jacob so much that he wants to kill him. Where have we read before of a brother hating another brother and wanting to kill him?
Cain and Abel.
Reminds us of Cain and Abel, doesn't it? So Rebekah's plan is to have Jacob flee to Laban. And notice she says in verse 44, stay with him a few days. And when your brother's wrath turns away, I'll call you back. So she thinks this is only for a temporary time. But as we said, she's never going to see Jacob again. He's actually going to be away for 20 years. And by the time he returns, his mother will be dead. So she says, why should I be bereaved of both of you in one day? What does that mean?
Sounds like both are dying, or both died.
Yeah, so how would that happen? Well, if Esau kills Jacob, that's obvious that he'll be dead. But then Esau's guilty of murder, right? And so if justice prevails, he too would be executed. So she's trying to, trying to save a situation where she ends up losing both children at once. All right, final verse.
Then Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm sick and tired of these local Hittite women. I would rather die than see Jacob marry one of them.
Okay, that's your whole verse. Okay. So this takes us back to the end of the previous chapter where we read that Esau married these women and how they were a grief of mind to Rebekah and Isaac. Well, Rebekah can't tell Isaac, your favorite son wants to kill my favorite son. So she uses a common problem that they share. They both hate the wives of Esau. So she says, I couldn't stand it if Jacob made the same mistake. So let's send him away. And so with that, when we get to chapter 28, we'll see that Isaac agrees to send Jacob off to Rebekah's brother in Haran. Okay, it's Friday night. It's been a long day. And so God bless you guys. I will see you Tuesday.